Good evening, good afternoon, good morning. Tonight, I'd like to talk about elections. Yeah, I have said on numerous occasions that without reforms, elections are a farce. Here is the same thing being said by somebody else. And I think he is saying what needs to be said. Just listen to this, and then I will comment on it.
Very fast. 2008 presented itself as an opportune period. Yaifanya kuti pakaitwa political reforms through the global political agreement yakakaitwa sponsored in a SADC. Right. But unfortunately nothing happened. Our opposition proved to be lethargic, very useless. Right. And you cannot expect a ruling party to reform itself from power. Then when Zulu reformer South African Foreign Affairs Minister even complained opposition with even why are you in the government and you are not talking about the reforms? So why are you there? Right. What is going on? You are with JDU. And they thought they had overwhelming support, right, which would outweigh the need for demand for electoral reform. Right. And they were outmaneuvered by Mugabe. Right. They were outmaneuvered by Mugabe. 2018, vakapinda into elections with no reform. Right. Of which they should have used the demand for elections as the leverage, right, for the holding of elections. They were quiet, but you got one way. And it proved fatal, disastrous, raw, vakamenya one of that. Right. Whether through rigging, through what, because when you talk of rigging, it means the electoral process is simple. Very flawed, it's very facilitated rigging. Right. So don't talk of rigging when you don't talk of reform. Right. Because the reforms do a lot of assess. So we are now having a situation in this country. 2018, with no reforms, there should have not been any elections. Right. 2018 again, we had elections and with no reform. Look at it now. At the end of the day, we have the so-called democratic elections with the flawed electoral systems. When the political environment, the terrain is uneven, right, the opposition equal change, but ability. My reforms, my reforms. At the end of the day, we are not protesting on the streets. We were protesting for reform. That's useless, man. We are playing with our collective intelligence, man. Right.
There we have it, playing with our collective intelligence. I think this is the reality that most Zimbabweans do not want to address and deal with honestly. We cannot have elections without reforms and expect those elections to come out with anything other than the present Zanu PF being declared the winner. Once you have participated in those elections, to turn around and say, oh no, the elections were rigged, it's too late. The damage has already been done. This is what we are having. This is what the discussion is all about. This is what we should be having. We cannot keep on going round and round in circles and expect change. There's not going to be any meaningful change without reforms. I'm glad we have had a chance for Godfrey to join us. Good evening, Godfrey.
Good evening, listeners. Good evening to you. I'll just mute a little bit so that I shut off the background noise that is coming from this end.
I'm sure you have listened to the video as well.
I mean, yes, I have listened to it. But just continue. I'll mute for a while.
Okay. Well, the Sorry, Godfrey will not be able to comment because there's some background noise. He says, but what what we have got to deal with here is where do we go from here? To keep on participating in an electoral process that is so flawed that even with when they won 73% of the vote in 2008, Zanu PF was still able to wriggle out of that and deny the opposition a vote is absolutely meaningless. That is the main thrust. How are we going to get out of this? The main reason why we can't get out of it is we have got an opposition that still maintains that they can win rigged elections. So now we are now locked into this madness, winning rigged elections. In other words, elections 2013 were rigged. And in 2014, MDC, the main opposition, led by Morgan Tsvangirai, had their Congress. And in that Congress, the party actually came out with a resolution that they were not going to participate in future elections without reforms. So the slogan then was no reform, no elections. But by December 2015, the party changed its position. They were going to participate in future elections. And the then party spokesperson, Douglas Monzora, explained that they are confident they will drag Zanu PF to implement the democratic reforms, screaming and kicking. The reality is, of course, they failed to drag Zanu PF to implement even one token reform. So they participated in 2018 without any reforms. Chamisa, when he was pressed, why are we participating in these elections without reforms? He claimed that MDC Alliance had strategies to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. And of course, when the results came, he was the first one to claim that Zanu PF had rigged the elections. He never mentioned about the strategies that they had to stop Zanu PF rigging the elections. So the country was locked again into this election process, and come 2023, we are being told CCC is going to win big. They are telling us that the party has got strategies of winning in rigged elections. And one of their flagship strategy of that is mass voter registration, followed by mass voting. The mass voter registration strategy started soon after the 2018 elections. And they announced that they were going to target registering 6 million new voters. By May last year, 4 years down the line, ZEC announced that the party had only registered, or rather, not the party, rather, but in total, the number of people who had registered was only 250,000, which was 4% of their target 6 million. In other words, their flagship strategy had failed, was a flop, dead in the water. and yet they still maintain that they are participating in these elections. The truth of the matter is the opposition know they are going to benefit from participation, because as long as they participate, they will win some of the votes. And as long as they win some of the votes, they are quite happy with that. And Zanu PF has been very careful. They have allowed the opposition to win some of the votes in all elections, regardless how flawed the process got. Zanu PF saw to it that the opposition did win some of the votes. So in this case, they know they will win some of the votes, and they are willing to go into the election for the sake of those few votes. But of course, they cannot tell the electorate, the ordinary Zimbabweans, that they are participating in these elections out of greed. So they've got to tell them a different story. They've got to convince them that they are going to win big these elections. I think it will be absolutely madness to allow the country to be dragged into yet another meaningless electoral process. And at the end of it, the opposition claimed that the elections were rigged. And it will be too late, of course. And then the country will be dragged into another 5 years of this Zanu PF dictatorship. That is the reality that the country has got to face. And I think in this particular case, the people of goodwill, the people with half a brain, have got now to stand up and say, this is totally unacceptable, and we are not going to allow it. The strategy going forward, in my view, is to emphasize that the process itself is flawed, illegitimate. There are already a mountain of evidence to show that. There's no verified voters roll. Zanu PF has already denied 3 million Zimbabweans in the diaspora the vote, constituting about 37%. How can you have free, fair, and credible election when one party is able to cherry pick on who can vote and deny 37% of the potential voters the vote, the right to vote? There's no free media. The regime is using state resources to buy votes, right, center, and left, etc., etc. So the process itself, we've got to produce the evidence to show the process is flawed. There is no way you can have free, fair, and meaningful election when you've got such a flawed process. So now that's number one. Number two, we have got to show the world that the opposition is participating out of greed. The opposition has been shown to be corrupt and incompetent. They have had the opportunity to implement the reforms. They failed to do so during the GNU. They were persuaded not to participate in the election without reforms by SADC. The European Union observed the 2018 election and came up with 23 recommendations of reforms that should be implemented before you go into the next election. And none of those reforms have been implemented. That is the reality we are dealing with. I think showing clearly that we have got a corrupt and utterly useless opposition, a discredited opposition, will only help in persuading SADC and whoever else will be tempted to rubber stamp these 2023 elections and give Zanu PF legitimacy. You deny Zanu PF political legitimacy, it will take us back to where we were in 2008 when SADC refused to endorse Mugabe's victory that year and forced Zanu PF to accept the need for democratic reforms, leading to the GNU. Like the gentleman at the beginning of this discussion explained, that was the golden opportunity to implement the democratic reforms so that there are free, fair, and credible elections. If we go back to that situation and have another GNU, we will have another golden opportunity to implement the reforms. And all we've got to make sure of is that this time the reforms are implemented. There is nothing rocket science about the reforms. MDC, Morgan Tsvangirai and his MDC friends did not fail to implement even one democratic reform because they are difficult. No, it's because they sold out. They are corrupt and incompetent. Given the opportunity to implement the reforms, there are many Zimbabweans out there who could do the job easily, who understand what the reforms are. The old gentleman there clearly showed that he understood what the reforms were all about and why without reforms we are just going round and round in circles. I think the opportunity is what we need. Deny Zanu PF legitimacy at the end of these elections, these coming elections, and we will have a new GNU. And this, out of the new GNU, hopefully we will get, instead of SADC, to be the guarantor of the political agreement, then we'll have the United Nations, for instance. And the United Nations will see to it that the reforms are implemented. This will get Zimbabwe out of this mess, out of this vicious cycle of participating in flawed electoral processes only to give Zanu PF legitimacy, and then at the end of the day, turn around and say elections were rigged. We have got to accept we are stuck with Zanu PF, but we also must accept we are stuck with the opposition, which people risked life and limb to elect into power in the hope they will implement the democratic reforms to get us out of this mess. They have sold out. MDC stroke CCC have sold out. They not only failed to implement the democratic reforms when they had the golden opportunity to do so during the GNU, they are the ones who are now perpetuating Zanu PF dictatorship by participating in an electoral process that is so flawed, there cannot be any meaningful change. We need to face the reality. Without reforms, there will be no meaningful, free, fair, and credible elections in Zimbabwe. And without free, fair, and credible elections, there will be no good governance. And we will just be deceiving ourselves to think we can have good governance without reforms. Godfrey, I don't know whether you're free now you want to say something there before we close.
Yes, partly so, yeah. I'll just make sure there's no noise. I do agree with maybe your conclusion there, where you are saying there is need for a national transitional authority. And also, I also agree with the gentleman in the video up to a certain extent. I agree with him that there is need for, as he describes it, a Komatsu grader to just get rid of the present, whatever is there. And in other words, that's installing a body that will usher in a transitional government. But I also agree with him when he said the opposition relaxed. They thought they would overwhelm ZANU with vote numbers, which they did. I have to admit, and this is the same kind of strategy which they are banking on to deliver them the change.
Well, I think that is arguable. To keep on maintaining that they've got majority support in terms of rallies, or what? On what basis can we say they've got the majority support?
Okay. I was going to go to the situation where ZANU admitted that we lost, but we remained in power. I wanted to just dwell on that a little bit, because in other words, the opposition had managed to get the numbers they required, regardless of the flaws that existed in the process. So up to the stage of handing over of power, they had managed to override the flaws.
Which
came up
year
with
are you
numbers.
talking about? Which elections are you talking about, Godfrey?
Whatever the elections, maybe when they amassed 73%. And
Yeah.
there was
I
admission.
think we've got to look at 2008 as the watershed, because before that, the opposition had never had the opportunity to implement reforms anyway. 2008 was the watershed, because at the end of it, that's when SADC set this GNU, forced Mugabe to accept that there is need for a government of national unity. And the primary purpose of the GNU was to implement the democratic reforms to make sure that there are free, fair, and credible elections. So if we go back behind 2008, there was no opportunity to implement reforms. So we cannot talk about beyond that. We've got to talk from that point. That was the watershed, and that is what we are talking about here. Where that opportunity should have been used. And even now that we've got the international community, including SADC, convinced that there is need for reforms, that is the point when you should have said, no, we are not going to participate in a meaningless election. In fact, it was SADC itself that said, do not participate in 2013, because they appreciated that without reforms, the elections would be meaningless. So I think that we need to make that distinction.
When they got the 73%, if we agreed on the 73%, was the system free and fair then?
There was reforms that were carried out run up to the 2008 elections, which were initiated mostly by SADC in the background. For instance, this new rule that said votes must be counted in each polling station. I think that was part of that initiative, and some of the blatant vote rigging that Zanu PF had, SADC had persuaded them to stop that. So they went into the 2008 elections with, if you want, this Zanu PF vote rigging machinery switched off. This is why the voting was carried out. There was no, as far as I can remember, there was no cases of violence run up to the March vote. But when Zanu PF learned that the opposition was winning, that's when they switched back the vote rigging machinery. And the first thing it did was to tell ZEC to stop announcing the results. They took over and they started recounting the votes, and it took them 6 weeks to count 5 million votes, which you can see that was part of the flawed process. You do not need 6 weeks to count 5 million votes. And then they, particularly the presidential vote, they managed to whittle down the 73% of Morgan Tsvangirai to 47%, enough to force the runoff. And during the runoff, the Zanu PF vote rigging machinery was switched back on, full blast. That's when we had the wanton violence. That is what happened.
Okay, so what you are saying there is the SADC administered process is the one that ushered a purported win then. Is that what?
Yeah, I mean, the reforms, the 2008 elections could not be compared with the elections that went before that, in the sense that there were a number of fundamental changes that SADC had managed to force Zanu PF to accept. So in that regard, the March 2008 election was significantly free, fair, and credible than any other election that the country had had up to that point. But the runoff, the June one, that's when the violence came in again. The wanton violence then was absolutely unbelievable, the worst that the country had ever seen.
Okay, I think then that's the situation that should be highlighted. That when SADC managed to switch off partly the rigging machine, everything went well. And to maintain that that control, reforms recommended by SADC should have been implemented. I think that is very crucial to highlight that, because people in general do not understand what happened, what gave them the ability to achieve a win in brackets here. So if that is highlighted clearly, I'm sure many people will believe, will tend to go along with the need for implementation of reforms. But I also wanted to go on and say they still believe, probably they've forgotten that they had SADC behind them when they won, again in brackets. They still believe the numbers alone will give them the win. that's why although I listened to you when you were saying that the voter registration, the exercise has not gone in their favor at all to get the numbers which they are expecting to get. So that alone, they are already chasing. They are already behind on that. But I think when they go into, rather than greed, I think they are going in, they are approaching this with a double-edged sword, where one side of the sword is probably saying we are going to win overall. And the other side is saying, yes, even if we lost the top position, we should maintain the second position, which, according to me, I don't think it's greed. It's probably their strategy to remain relevant on the political scene. So I think we need to criticize their approach where they say they are going to get the maximum votes or to win the election in total. But the other side, it's up to them. The other side of just maintaining the whatever numbers they have in parliament, we can leave them to play around with that. We can criticize the...
Well, I think we need to face the reality here that the price of their maintaining their position as the country's main opposition is at the expense of the country's failure to hold free, fair, and credible elections. And the consequences of that is perpetuating the Zanu PF dictatorship. The dictatorship is the main problem here. If Zanu PF was winning these elections free, fair, and credible, in other words, the people have had their meaningful say in who should govern the country, that's another matter. It's like here, the Conservative Party won. If they were to mess up, the truth of the matter is, in a democratic election, they did win, and they've got the mandate to govern. But in Zanu PF, they did not have the mandate because they are rigging elections. And to keep on perpetuating the system under the pretext that we will win big. And when they fail, they say, well, actually, among ourselves, we can agree, we are okay as long as we maintain being the main opposition in the country. That is totally unacceptable to the country. The country needs free, fair, and credible elections, not just a question of maintaining an opposition in power. That is what we are talking about here. No one has got the right to rig the election. That's number one. Number two, the opposition does not have the right to sell the right of the people to a meaningful say in the country just to maintain their own position as the country's main opposition. That is ridiculous. We cannot allow that. That is what we are talking about here.
Anyway, I don't know if you addressed the issue in that video where the gentleman was saying there is no connection, or implying there is no connection between the army, as he says, and the party. Where you are saying you need the party, the army to be on your side to get rid of the president, which I don't believe it's possible to get them to fight the present present regime. So
Well, I did not actually play that video to that level, but on that point, I think it is important to understand that the democratic reforms could have been implemented if MDC had kept their eyes on the ball. The army was not going to play any role in that. Did not play any role in that. They did not stop MDC play implementing the reforms. So in this particular case, why would, if we were to have a second the GNU or interim government or some arrangement, why would we say the army is going to play a major role?
yeah, maybe we can leave it for some other time to debate that last part. But I do agree with you on the NTA, and I also agree that, as we have explained, that opposition should look at a total win, not a partial win, just to maintain guarantee that they are still a force to reckon with within the opposition setup.
No, I think the party, whether they win or they lose in an election, is another matter. What needs to be understood here is that elections must be free, fair, and credible. The ordinary people must be given a meaningful say in the process. Legitimacy is important. I think that is the other thing that the gentleman was also emphasizing. That in this particular case, if the process is so flawed, you cannot say the winner is legitimate because the process is flawed. You cannot say the loser is legitimate because the process is flawed. So the important thing is to get this process to be cleaned up so that it is legitimate.
That was a very good point there, where he was talking about the system, the flawed system producing a winner or a loser. Both are illegitimate because their loss is based on a flawed system, and the win is also based on a flawed system. So that's rendering them all illegitimate because they are products of a flawed system.
Yeah, I mean, some of it, Godfrey, is common sense. Let's look at the issue of the voters' roll. If you do not have a verified voters' roll, how can you say then that you have won the elections? Because the people who are there to observe it and verify it will say, well, how can we verify it when you say you've won 2.4 million votes? Where did those votes come from? You know, if you don't have a voters' roll, how do we know that there are actually even 2.4 million voters on that voters' roll? We can't verify anything because those voters' roll, whenever people have had a close look at them, they found so many errors, in some cases duplicating names of the same individual repeated as many as 4 or 5 times. Some of the people who have died 10 years ago are still on the voters' roll. So how do we know those people who are still on the voters' roll did not vote? So you 2.4 million, we cannot verify anything without a verified voters' roll.
Yes, that's a point. That one. It's an issue that is very fundamental to the process. It's the foundation of everything that the numbers are based on.
I
You
totally
are very
agree.
right on that one.
And in this particular case, one also has got to question the credibility of the opposition, who will willingly participate in a process that is so flawed that you don't even know who is on the voters' roll. You know, one has got to ask, so why are you participating? Other than the fact that you must know, could you have agreed with these other guys and saying, if you participate, you give the system legitimacy and will reward you for your participation. Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense for somebody to participate either. This is where the opposition is now losing political credibility, particularly when you keep on participating, even when you know, when these things have been pointed out to you again and again. No, you cannot participate until these errors have been, these problems have been ironed out, and you still participate. One is going to ask, why are you so persistent in participating in a system that is so flawed that even if you were to say you have won, no one can verify it. No one can say, yes, you are legitimate, because the system itself is so flawed. I don't know on what basis your claim is based.
True. I think the video of that gentleman should be played over and over again, because he puts over some points that are very pertinent to the situation that we have, and also maybe solutions going forward. In his case, solution is just to get rid of everything. How, I don't know, but just get an authority to usher in a democratic government, or lay down the process, the system for democratic elections. So I do agree with that gentleman as well.
Yeah, on that note, I think we will close. It was supposed to be about 30 minutes, but now we are getting on to 43 minutes. On that one, thanks very much again, Godfrey, for joining in, and we'll call it a day. And good night.
Thank you, and good night, listeners as well.